So during the Enlightenment, as we've already discussed, the neoclassical style of architecture is really quite dominant, and this is readily apparent in a lot of the major structures that we see created, and we see this interest in classical Greek and Rome. But it's interesting to note that we also see other styles which come about as part of another type of revival. And some of these styles include things like Gothic, Baroque, and even some very diverse examples, which come from beyond traditional European canons when it comes to architectural design. So we're going to begin here by taking a look at a very well-known, very popular example. And the image that we see here, these are the Houses of Parliament in London. So the original Houses of Parliament that stood on this site were burned down in 1834. And the Parliamentary Commission elected and decided that the new Parliament building would either be based on a Gothic or a Elizabethan style. And so they ended up hiring a couple of architects. One guy in particular they hired was Charles Barry, who was assisted by A.W.N. Pugin. Barry had actually traveled quite extensively and had done a lot of work in neoclassical styling. But again, the intent here was to do something that wasn't so much neoclassical, but in fact was Gothic. And this is actually kind of an interesting point of view. So we've been, kind of smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution here. And during the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that happens is we see this proliferation of inexpensive and really, to be honest, in many cases, poor quality goods that are produced. And a lot of people became really quite disillusioned with the quality of goods and materials that were produced by this industrial culture. And so, some famous writers and other individuals really began to kind of, think back to the medieval period, to the artistry, to the craftsmanship, to the spirituality even of the medieval. And as a result, things like the Gothic style kind of became in vogue once again. So the intent here was to reflect something of Britain's past, of its history, and it's done so in a way here that reflects kind of the late Gothic English style. Now, the building is really much more complex than that, to be honest. In terms of its plan, of its layout, of its symmetry, it is really almost Palladian. It is laid out in a format that comes really from the Renaissance, and by extension, thereby, from neoclassical or from Greek and Roman ideas. Even the facade here, in terms of its organization, reflects some of those concepts. But the details here are really extensively Tudor and also Gothic. And so we have this really quite complex structure which reflects quite a bit of history and quite a bit of very deliberate intent. So as we've already kind of mentioned, this is a site that has quite a history. And some of the earliest parts of this site go back into the medieval period. Now, what we're looking at here in this image is Westminster Hall. And much of Westminster Hall is really quite old and is some of the earliest remaining components of the entire structure that we see here when we're looking at the Houses of Parliament. Westminster Hall was modified and adapted by Barry and Pugin, and really largely by Pugin. He was largely responsible for much of the interior decoration and Tudor details that we see when we look at the Houses of Parliament. They added some elements, including the large window and also the niches on the sides. But much of what remained that was still intact was essentially just left as it is and incorporated into their design. So again, in this image here, we can see the interior here of the central lobby at Westminster Hall. And again, while Charles Barry is given largely most of the credit, really, it really appears, looking at the historical documentation, that in fact it was Augustus Pugin who was largely responsible, at least for the interior design and decoration that we see when we take a look here at the interior of the Houses of Parliament, and specifically in this case, the interior of the Westminster Hall. So here we have a really interesting example. The building that we're looking at here is the Royal Pavilion from Brighton, England, and it was really designed essentially as kind of a pleasure palace, a seaside pleasure palace for King George IV, who at the time was just the Prince Regent. It was designed by John Nash, and it incorporates some really interesting things. First off, one of the really unusual things about this structure is that it incorporates an iron skeleton. And that's pretty astonishing, really, because the use of an iron skeleton in this manner becomes a really important element in the design of architecture, and it allowed the architect to really push boundaries and do some very creative things. There are actually some beautiful columns in the kitchen, the interior of this structure, that are cast iron, that are shaped like palms, which is really pretty striking, of course, and well in theme, really, with the idea we're looking at. It incorporates a variety of domes and minarets, and it also is intended really to reflect the colonial nature of England during this period in history. This particular example that we're looking at has often been referred to as a style called Indian Gothic, and we certainly see some of these elements of Indian architecture blended with a variety of other influences. So, and here we're looking at another example of Revivalist architecture. This example here, designed by Charles Garnier, is the Opera House in Paris. And the Paris Opera House is a really incredibly beautiful, sumptuous, rich example of a structure that was designed in a neo-Baroque style. And the exterior is very, very sumptuous and beautifully detailed. The interior is also very, very cleverly designed in terms of the way that it manipulates and addresses ideas about traffic and getting people in and out of the complex, in and out of the actual opera house itself. So Garnier in this example really kind of combines a variety of things. We do have a lot of Baroque elements and design, but the structure itself in terms of its plan also really does reflect some of the ideas which were important and believed in the Royal Academy at the time too, of a kind of a central radiating plan. So really some very Palladian, once again, or Renaissance ideas about structure and layout. He was actually criticized quite a bit for his excessive use of ornament by some individuals at the time, but it became so popular that many later examples of architecture for palaces, for theaters, for opera houses, etc., really mimic this design and follow this neo-Baroque aesthetic. And it's kind of appropriate, I think, really, when we're talking about an opera house. When you think about opera and you think about the culture, etc., then this style, this sense of ostentation is probably really kind of quite apropos. The example we're looking at here is the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, and it's a really remarkable structure on a number of levels. It was designed by Henri Labouste, and what he does here is really pretty amazing. He's taking a plan, an idea, a concept here that really harkens back to classicism, to Renaissance ideas, and really in terms of the overall structure, it's kind of based on almost a basilica, an early basilica. But his use of materials is what really sets this apart. You can see these beautiful, tall, slender columns. These are cast iron columns. And they're actually done in the shape of a traditional kind of Corinthian style. But the way that they're utilized here, and with the openings and the space that are available with the glass and the light coming in, create a much more contemporary but very elegant sense of light, of open space, and it's really a beautifully organized structure. The lowest level here is organized for the stacks, essentially for the masses of books on shelves, with reading rooms above on the upper level. And on one hand, you could say that it still kind of reflects the architect's fear, the architect's inability at this time to break away from those classical forms. But on the other hand, the novel use of materials here is really quite striking and beautiful. The first architect for us to look at who really truly breaks away from any relationship to classical antiquity has got to be Joseph Paxton. Paxton initially really kind of made his way in the world designing greenhouses. He had a couple of important patrons and designed some really extensive and beautiful structures that would utilize large sheets of glass supported by iron frames. And Paxton eventually puts in for and gets the job to create this enormous, massive structure called the Crystal Palace. And it's quite a challenge because it's actually a temporary structure. It was intended for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, and the Great Exhibition. And we've seen some of these before. There's a Great Exhibition coming up that we'll be talking about in Paris. One of the central, ideas there, of course, is the erection of the Eiffel Tower. Later, we have the World's Fair, Great Exposition in Chicago. But so this is an earlier one, and this is an opportunity where Britain intended to display their wealth, their innovation, their intelligence, really, their sophistication. And so they designed this enormous hall to house all of this stuff. And the figures are just absolutely staggering. The structure itself was all based upon a combination of prefabricated elements that he had designed and had made so they could be assembled on site. They were all wrought iron and glass elements based on a 4-foot module. The structure itself was 1,848 feet long. And there was a series of galleries that were built using these 4-foot modules that alternated between 24 feet and 48 feet wide, and they'd go up 20 feet every 72 feet, and then culminate in this massive central nave, this vault that was 72 feet in width. So he had to use these enormous 49-inch sheets of glass in order to do this. They were placed upon furrows. And it created this incredible, really unique, and very, very innovative structure. And it housed all sorts of amazing things inside. It was designed actually within 10 days, which is pretty amazing as well. Had over 1 million square feet of glass. Inside of this were over 13,000 exhibits. Over 6 million people came to see this and to walk through the exhibition. Some of the things that were seen inside included things like the Jacquard loom, an envelope machine, various tools, appliances, steel-making displays, a reaping machine from the United States, all sorts of things. The structure, again, was temporary. It was actually disassembled after the exhibition and then reassembled outside of London because it was so popular. However, it later burned down in 1936.